been trainers, please let me know. So thank you everyone for joining. We'll go ahead and get started. So the objective for today's meeting is that we want to start kicking off this process for reviewing the quote charter / readmes of each of the working groups and move them through this formalization process that we came up with a little while ago. So we have a few of the leads here today. We're going to talk about the best practices group, the vulnerability disclosures group, and the identifying security threats. So with that, I think the approach I was thinking of, and please feel free to jump in and comment, is we'll just have each lead go ahead and present the overview of their group, discuss the projects specifically that they're working on and what they anticipate working on in the next year or so. We can have open discussion after that. We can actually go through the README separately as well. And then at the end, we can kind of discuss if we see any overlaps or other ways to facilitate sharing or getting these things sort of more in sync. Any questions or comments about that before we get started? Are there things that other folks want to cover during these discussions? Okay, with that, I am going to go on mute for a minute and let's start with best practices. Probe, you want to jump in there, or whoever's presenting for you guys?
I would love to, Ryan. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Krobe. I'm here today to talk about my favorite working group, the Developer Best Practices Working Group. Our objective is to help provide open source developers with best practices recommendations and easy ways to learn and apply them. We do this through kind of three objectives. We're looking to identify good practices, requirements, and tools. We're looking to help those maintainers and developers learn how to write secure software through courses and tooling potentially available in their IDEs or other external tools. And then we're looking to help provide ways that developers can adopt these good practices into their daily work. We currently have 5 sub-projects that are part of the group. And my dream is someday to figure out how to get a copy of our little reference architecture picture plugged into a markdown file. That's a problem for another day. Our 5 projects are the Common Requirement Enumeration Project. This is an OWASP sponsored project that identifies requirements that are banned universally across different specifications. So, for example, they started off with NIST 853, and they're kind of programmatizing those requirements so that they can be exposed through other tools. Next project is our Secure Software Development Fundamentals EXB class. The purpose of this is to help developers learn the fundamentals of developing secure code. We have SKF, the Security Knowledge Framework, which is our 3rd project. The purpose of that is to help, actually has a couple different, it serves all 3 of our quadrants. It helps identify good practices or errors in code, helps developers adopt that by showing examples of how to write code better, and helps provide them learning about security requirements or industry frameworks that might be relevant to a specific piece of software. This is a web-based application. I'm pretty excited about that. Then we have our awesome CII Best Practices Badges project. And the purpose of that is to help developers identify and adopt good practice. And this, again, helps identify a series of OSS and FLOSS good practices and implement a badging system to kind of, so developers can humble brag a bit, saying, look how great I am. I do things at a certain level of maturity. I can demonstrate this capability. And then finally, our last project is our Scorecard Project. And that is a tool that helps automate the analysis of a project and gives you kind of a feel for how many of the practices some of these projects, a petitioner project could execute on. Are they doing that? Do they have published tests? Do they have different factors enabled in the project. I have a procedural question after all this is done for Carly about where the heck my meeting videos go and how can I get them? And that way I can accurately get those reflected in my meeting notes. And I recognize that there's a question on the floor.
Yeah, I was curious about intersections between the Scorecards project and the metrics project in identifying security threats.
I would have to route you for specific questions to Dan, but yeah, there absolutely could be either a synergy or relationship between them. We're not looking at scoring anything with the scorecard. We're just basically saying here's a list of desired security objectives, and does this project meet those criteria or not? I don't know if Dan Lawrence can speak a little further on that specifically.
Sure. Yeah, Michael's probably the best one to answer. But yeah, I think at some point the dashboard was pulling in data and displaying it. I'm not quite sure what the current plans are for it, though.
Yeah, it is.
Michael's good.
Yep. I can talk about it at mine or now, whatever you guys want. So the purpose of the metric dashboard is to pull together data, not necessarily to calculate it. So the scorecard being a tool, metric is the service. It would be one way of looking at it.
Okay, so there's some overlap between the inputs to the score, and so if I think of the metrics project as having a bunch of different data elements, some subset of those overlap or feed into the thing that would be calculated in scorecard, or are these totally different kinds of metrics?
No. So some of it is directly consuming the output of the scorecard. So scorecard runs on a project X, has this set of data. We'll suck in that data and display it for that project. We'll also suck in other things from other tools, but we'll provide the web UI and the API and whatever we need for folks to consume. Say, tell me about X.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, and Dan, that's similar for the best practices data. So the idea is both scorecard and best practices provide data that is consumed by security metrics and made available through an API and a visual dashboard.
Okay, thanks. I didn't know that.
We also have a set of participant personas in the open source development world that we're collaborating with another working group on. And along with that, you have user pain points. So some of our next steps would be, as we get the integration of our 5 sub-projects a little bit tighter, we would be able to kind of reflect upon those pain points and see, do we have any areas of opportunity in any of these 5 areas? And then we're also looking at curating that set of desirable good practices a developer could follow. So reviewing things that are currently in the scorecard, reviewing industry frameworks like 853 or 161 or the cybersecurity framework, to see if we could pull out a series of simple requirements for developers. If you want to have better quality in regards to security, here's some things you can do. And then we'll also be constantly thinking about how we can improve or expand upon the EXD classes. So I think David had a plan that about every year and a half, we might refresh that content. So theoretically, this group could provide feedback to say, we've identified this set of practices, we'd like to get a new class added or get the current class adjusted. That's what our dream is, to help people code more goodly.
I think
Any additional questions or feedback?
More goodly is a great OKR. Quick question, which working group are you working with on the personas?
The vulnerability disclosure working group.
Awesome. And then are those going to be published publicly at some point? Because I could definitely see those being useful to a number of other groups. Like the metrics dashboard or even tooling and then, things like that, if we were to expand on those?
Yes, they will be published publicly. It is a less sexy activity than other things, so there is less participant interest in it. But my dream would be to figure out where the best place to formally publish those are once they're refined. And actually, I'm leveraging them in a couple other working groups. They're not OpenSSF related. So I think they'll be very useful, and my dream is to get them publicly published in the near future.
I'm shocked that you don't have tons of volunteers to write specs. That's just amazing.
I don't know why people don't love personas and user stories. I don't get it.
Personally find them interesting, but maybe not everybody's the same. No, that's really cool though. I think those will be very, very useful for everyone.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Crow before we jump on to the next one, which will continue with Crow? All right, take it away. On to the next one.
Awesome. Well, I'm Crow. I'm here to talk about my favorite working group, the Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group. Purpose of this group is to help improve overall security of open source software ecosystem by helping to mature and advocate a well-managed vulnerability reporting and communication set of practices. We're looking to we have three main objectives. We're looking to document and promote reasonable vulnerability disclosure and coordination practices amongst the open source software ecosystem, trying to specifically initially target maintainers, but there's a lot of, again, those user personas I mentioned, there's a lot of other interested people. This particular working group has a lot of representation from the research bug bounty community. So they're very interested in the finder persona and those pain points. But again, my main focus would be to focus on open source developers first, address that constituency and those unique pain points, and then we will benefit the other personas as well. We have working on identifying vulnerability disclosure pain points for the maintainer, consumer, security researchers, and our next step would be to kind of take some steps to address those. We have those pain points documented. Those are published. I need to figure out a better way, like with the personas, to find a consistent way to publish that as an artifact and then let people leverage that or collaborate or build upon it. But we have those pain points documented in a series of Google documents, is what it is. And then we're looking to facilitate the development and adoption of standards-based open source vulnerability exchange. So we're looking at things like CertCC's Vince tool. We're talking about standards like OVAL or CVRF. We just had a really good debate about the DWF project, which we kicked off as a potential competitor, frenemy, companion of the CVE program. So we're kind of talking about all things related to vulnerability management and disclosure. And again, my particular focus is to help give open source maintainers tools or templates or recommendations on how they can manage it, because most of them are not software vendors, and they don't necessarily, they aren't professional security folks. So make it as simple as possible. And that is about that right now. We are working on a vulnerability disclosure white paper, which we hope that'll be our kind of first major deliverable, which we would be able to address frame the problem and try to provide a series of recommendations, again, for open source. And then I'm having people that have had a lot of interest outside of the open source community to be able to leverage this potentially at a broader industry level. Here's a set of reasonable practices. Might be simpler to implement than ISO or some of the other existing CVD, the MPD, multi-party disclosure frameworks. So our first deliverable is going to be this white paper that we just kicked off. We now have a straw man for, and we've assigned some section owners. So we're hoping to have potentially a deliverable ready for review maybe early midsummer would be our dream. And then we go kind of on a road show. I see a lot of synergy just naturally between this and the developer best practices group. I think that we will be able to kind of identify vulnerability disclosure good practices and then help advertise them or broadcast them through mechanisms like the CII badges or the EXD training class. Again, I think there's a big interrelation between this particular part of development and the broader writing better software methods. Any
Do you-
questions or comments?
Yeah, do you anticipate like this group primarily be more focused, kind of like how best practices is currently, where it's kind of more documentation and information for developers, or at some point will there be tooling involved, like the exchanging of vulnerability data and things between vendors? Like, kind of what's the vision there?
There absolutely will be tooling. I had hoped the group had a better interest in the Vint efforts, because I think that was a nice Kickstarter potentially for having a consistent way to share vulnerability information and include related constituents. The team wasn't super interested in that, but yeah, eventually, and I feel this group should have opinions on things like OVAL and CBRS, CSAF, and be able to have an opinion to provide to the open source community. This is the right way you should participate in these disclosures. You should or should not leverage CVE if DWF is an alternative, and then kind of advocate once we have formed our opinions, kind of advocate for that, and then potentially try to influence those standard bodies to help be more open source friendly. Some of us participate in the with MITRE and the CVE board and stuff in our work capacity, and I'd like to help to see a broader open source perspective brought into some of those groups.
Cool.
Not just probe from Red Hat, but the OpenSSF has this kind of opinion and needs these things out of these standards and tools.
Yeah, that would be really awesome, because I could definitely see how this organization could help influence some of those things to pick up some adoption. I think there's a lot of disparity across the board right now, right? There's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of competing standards out there that people are trying to be nice to bring some kind of unity across that.
And CVD is a very heavy process intensive process. So ideally we'll be able to provide things like a generic reporter template, so that an open source project just copy and paste this template, put it in their repo. If you have an issue, this is the type of information we want. Provide a generic security handling process policy. This is how our project could copy and say, this is how we handle vulnerability reporting. These are any SLAs or expectations people should have. So again, providing some common sense, simple templates that a project could use, and hopefully to drive a little more consistency. And when there's a complicated thing like how do I get a CVE, try to make that as simple as possible for a small project to be able to get in there and not have to go petition to be a CNA themselves.
Yeah, definitely. That would be great. Yeah, I thought the Vince project is really interesting too. I'm surprised there isn't more uptick there. Is it just like lack of interest, you think, due to availability, or is there just like a fundamental concern there?
I think it's availability and the fact the Vince tool is not currently open sourced. I talk with Art Mannion all the time, and that's a desire of the Carnegie Mellon team, is to open source this. And
Right.
I think once that happens, we will start to get actual developers get in there and try to make it a little better. But I think we'll also get broader participation, because people inherently distrust closed source things in this world, so that they're skeptical about it until they can look at it.
That's fair. Yeah.
Regardless of intentions, I think the CERT team has the best intentions. It's just a matter of procedurally, can they get this thing, you jump through all their hoops internally into their masters to get this open source. And I think once that happens, we can reopen that conversation to say, perhaps Vince is the recommended tool of OpenSSF if you want to do vulnerability management. maybe this is our recommended path. And then we could feed that into the best practices, maybe as part of the badging that, hey, you are plugged into Vince or not. And you get a smiley face or a frowny face.
Yeah, that could be really interesting, actually. I think once that matures, and like you said, it actually gets open sourced at some point, which hopefully is soon, I know, according to their plans. But yeah, if we had like some recommended guidelines and people could just jump in and like I said, build it into the badging, which could then show up in the scorecards and the metrics dashboard and all this kind of stuff, and just get people on the same page, like that would be really, really cool.
David?
Yeah, I think I actually totally understand the little bit of concern. Many of us have been bitten before on the promises not delivered. And I think the problem is the folks we're interacting with are good people, but not the ones who make the call. Is there anything that we, the OpenSSF, could do that might push, we formal letter? I don't know. Hey, we'd like to use this, but you've said you release it this way. Can you do that? I mean, is that something that, the working group or the TAC or something else could help with?
Perhaps. I don't know where it sits on their backlog and prioritization, but I will definitely ask the question because I have to talk to Art. We're commenting on an ISO standard together, so I owe him feedback tomorrow. So I'll ask him. It's worth a try. If a letter from us, an email from us officially helps push them, that'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to see if there's something that we could even do to help push forward even the open sourcing of it, right? Like not just a letter, but hey, we've got a group of people that could, help run reviews and just get it prepped and ready and help drive some interest.
Well, and potentially maybe it gets adopted by the tooling project. This is kind of our official way. If we all agree, this could be our official tool for doing this piece. There's a lot of potential. But let me get some specifics from Art and team.
Cool. That sounds good.
And any additional comments or feedback? Is either do both of those efforts seem like we're going in the right direction?
This is Jennifer. I'm a new member, I guess, of the vulnerability disclosure group, and so far I think it's going really great. And thank you for your awesome facilitation. It's very inclusive and very productive and action oriented, which I definitely appreciate. I have a few kind of interrelated questions. So the white paper is this first deliverable. I love that idea that we're trying to put into writing things that have been maybe oral tradition before, and and we get that information and don't gatekeep it. So that's really exciting. You had mentioned a few things around creating templates for like policies or advisories. You talked about facilitating data exchange, and you had mentioned standards bodies. So I guess my big question is, in terms of thinking about the future roadmap of this group, what might those things look like? For example, in the template design, is this a template that we would kind of create and make freely available, or is this something that we would also try to publish or formalize through a standards body? And if so, are there specific standards bodies that you're leaning toward right now as an option? And then I guess the related question around data exchange is like, what does the concrete thing look like there? Is it standards work or is it something else?
So for the templates today, they're a much smaller focus than a protocol or standard. Do you have a series? Does the project have a series of questions they need researchers to answer so that they could move forward collaboratively on a vulnerability report? So I think this is something we can publish as part of the OpenSSF as a freely available template. Hey, here's recommended examples. And the same thing with a vulnerability disclosure and handling policy. I think we can cobble together a handful of paragraphs, very lightweight for development maintainers, that if they wanted to, they can adapt or modify to their own needs. But I think those are fairly simple things that, again, don't rise to the level of a standards body. Now, around vulnerability exchange, by virtue of my place of work, I am included in those conversations, those types of things like the CVSS standards bodies and the vulnerability through OASIS and everyone else on exchanging advisories and whatnot. I am not aware of any either Linux Foundation or OpenSSF participation in those groups. And those are important because those groups are where the really big decisions are made. So potentially the working group becomes that mechanism that we can get that representation in our community with those groups. Because again, today I'm in those groups and it's vendors and there is no one looking out for a maintainer or small project. Aside from, what I or Luke or somebody from
Yeah.
us or SUSE or Canonical, we might say something, but that's really about it.
That's a really interesting point. And not to go too deep down the rabbit hole, because I know we have other things to cover today, but I think it's very interesting. Like when we were writing the initial, mission and values for OpenSSF, a big part of it was being maintainers first. And I think that this is one very concrete example where representing maintainers can make a big difference as to what actually happens. Standards bodies are incredibly political, stressful places to be. And being able to represent that with some force behind us in particular, given that it's a vendor-driven landscape, is very appealing. So that I would just highlight that as a very interesting thing that you've brought up in this discussion, because to me, like having done standards before and felt the political weight of it all, I guess like hearing that you're raising this as a direction that we should go, and raising that there's really no one representing maintainers in those groups, feels like a place where we could potentially have some heavy hitting impact in a really concrete way, which is really exciting.
Thank you.
And that's all of my comments.
So if you could get one thing from the open source community or from our contributing companies to make your working group more impactful, what would it be?
For best practices, I would love if we could get the funding request model created, because one of our core tools is the FKF. It's a test suite. It does a lot of stuff, but it's run on like 12 Raspberry Pis underneath Glenn's desk in Norway. And I don't think that's a really great enterprise class infrastructure that's going to support us long term if we get a lot of uptick of adoption. So I would ask the TAC, can we get that process worked on so that we can develop our business case and come forward with a formal request? Hey, we'd like to get funding to put this in AWS and blah, blah. Here's what we think the cost could be. So, there's homework on us to do, but there's things like that, in particular around the funding for some of these tools that require infrastructure would be useful. For the vulnerability disclosure group,
Do you want me to? I can give a quick update on that
please.
probe. Just where we are in the process, which is not as close maybe as you want, but we're working on it. We have a proposed addendum to our OpenSSF charter to create a budget committee. We have a couple of tweaks left in that, and then we'll have the governing board vote on that. And then we'll get a budget committee started. We'll have a look at what we do currently have some funding, so we'll have a look at that, look at what our needs are. And then also that committee will work on the directed funding for projects, for TAC and working group projects. So we're working on it.
That's great.
I think it will probably still be a couple months down the road before we have something solid.
Yeah, and I think today 12 Raspberry Pis is okay because we have not done a pitched marketing effort to try to drive adoption. But eventually we want to endorse these as if you're an open source developer, here's an awesome set of free tools that you can use. And I don't know that, Glenn's cable modem can handle it. So we want to think about if we're kind of presenting ourselves as a kind of standardized enterprise class thing for open source, it would be nice to have a more resilient infrastructure.
Right, I agree. I interrupted you. Sorry, go on.
No.
You were going to expand on things necessary for the vulnerability
Well,
disclosure.
the vulnerability disclosure, I think once there is a decision on kind of what happens with the Vince tool, if that's what we want to use, there's potentially, I would need to work with the tooling group to see if they would agree to kind of maybe participate in that. I
Mhm.
don't know if there would be funding for infrastructure or whatnot. I don't know yet. But once we have our white paper, it would be great to, whether it's a press release or something in the next town hall, I think it'd be useful to start advertising, hey, these are some free templates. These are some really great tools and practices. We'd like to start to get the word out on this stuff to start driving adoption. So I can talk in a vacuum all day, but that doesn't do anybody any good. Doesn't make free software better.
And does not having sort of the small project maintainers that aren't security minded participate in the working group, is that an impediment to building out that persona? Or do you feel like the working group is able to build out that persona in the absence of those participants?
I think we're okay, and I really appreciate the researcher perspective, because again, that's something that there's a lot of contention between the maintainers and researchers. So I think we need to start to demystify that. So I think it's very important to have that perspective. I would love to have more maintainers or more kind of large project, like if have folks in Kubernetes or whatever, some larger project representation. That would be helpful, because I'm there. Marcus from Stuce shows up sometimes. Occasionally the canonical guys do, but really I don't see a lot of kind of maintainer project participation. So it would be helpful so that we get the right diversity of opinion. So it's not just my way and everyone kind of rubber stamps it.
Okay.
I try
and
my
so you're-
best, but I have a inherent set of biases that may or may not be acceptable by everybody.
Okay, sure. So it sounds like then your focus for open source projects is probably on the larger ones that would have a hope of having a more coordinated disclosure process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And I know like the Kube security people, they already have some of this, but it'd be great to again just get some more collaboration, some more opinions on it. And then as we start using it, it'd be wonderful to start citing some of these communities as exemplars for other smaller developers.
On that note, maybe just to raise to the TAC an idea. So we have all these different working groups and they meet pretty frequently because they're, very much in the weeds of working on doing things at the meetings. I'm wondering if it might be useful for the TAC to come up with some, like, I don't know what it would be, but like a maintainer advisory board or something, like a group of maintainers that we can call upon when we want their feedback on stuff without them necessarily having to know which working groups are working on what and to attend all of those meetings, but instead kind of like a review board or something of that flavor, where when we wanted that feedback, we could have representatives from like a number of large projects that we could share with. Just an idea that came to mind as Crow was talking about that.
That's cool. I'd like that.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea. We should consider how we could just kind of put something together informally, and then, when necessary, and we have questions, either surveys or get-togethers and things, like having that group of go-to people would be actually kind of useful, I think. So, awesome idea. All right. Any other questions for Crow before we move on to identifying security threats? Just want to be conscious of time. It was a great discussion. Going once, going twice.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Crow.
everybody. I appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, thank you. No, this was really, really, really interesting. All right, with that, Mike Scavetta, you are up. Do you want to present, or do you want me to try to share the?
Yeah, we could start here. I'll switch over at the right time to just do a show a screenshot, really, but to talk a little bit about the metric dashboard. But
Sounds good.
Yeah. So hi everybody. I am not Crob, but this is my favorite working group. Yeah. So we. I'm sorry about the name. I know the name is like super generic. It's too generic. I'm sorry. If we can make it better, that would be great. Purpose of the working group, or at least the way that we kind of described it was, understanding the threats out there, collecting data, providing recommendations, really trying to be hands-on and the connection back to the kind of core stakeholders, meaning the developers that use a project, the maintainers of the project, the compliance teams that need to attest to the quality of lots of projects. So we are I'm trying really hard to make all the sub projects fit that narrative. So I recognize it's not entirely coherent. We started out though, we have the threat paper, which looked at the entire kind of landscape of the open source, let's say, ecosystem. Kind of looked at that somewhat methodically, talked about the threats that can be injected in different areas, made a bunch of recommendations on where future work could be done to mitigate those risks, and in some ways tried to rank the risks as best we could. So we need to do another revision of that paper. We haven't really talked too much about it, but especially with the dependency confusion stuff that came out, I think that's a couple paragraphs that need to be added. But more substantially, it could probably just use a refreshing. The security metrics project is the one that we've talked the most about, though, since we got started, and this went through a couple revisions and lots of kind of planning and I don't want to say specs, but we wrote a lot of words. But we did do two proof of concepts. We're on the second one now, so I can give a quick demo of that. Yeah, it's just gonna work. Can I share screen?
Carly, you may need to do something so you can share a screen.
I'll stop. See if that helps.
Yeah, Ryan.
Yep.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, no, it's trying hard.
Share screen, you have to pick what you're going to share.
Oh, is that how we're?
There we go.
How's that? Are you seeing that?
Yes.
All right, cool. So this is a Grafana front end. This is, again, it's not quite a Raspberry Pi, but it's like my, employee like gratis Azure subscription. So we should at least put on a Raspberry Pi somewhere.
We can get you a Raspberry Pi, Mike. No problem.
Thanks.
That'll be the official infra of OpenSSF.
Nice. Just sitting in a Starbucks. Yeah. So what we have is, it's a cards metaphor and all that. The important thing is that down here, all of this data for the OpenSSF best practices comes from the scorecard. That's not the scorecard. The CII best practices badge stuff. The stuff on the right comes out of the scorecard project data. The stuff here in the middle is calculated just by querying GitHub. The data here is out of date because I haven't refreshed it in a while. But in theory, this would be refreshed daily or weekly or whatever. And then there's a whole bunch of projects that have been imported into this. The UI, I'm kind of struggling with just the UI limitations of Grafana, but there are a good number of projects. This should be everything that Scorecard or the CIA best practices collects kind of, and that I can get to in bulk. So my favorite one is left pad, of course. So left pad doesn't have anything for the CII. It does have, we were able to calculate some stuff for Scorecard, stuff in the middle. Security reviews was experimental. I'll get to that in a sec. So this is just one view. This is like the project specific view. I also want a separate view, which is given a list of projects or given a you know, show me the top 10 quote best projects according to some metric. I think this is where we can go from purely objective data to having an opinion. So the objective data is, at least from the dashboard's perspective, is that the scorecard says that this project is active or is not active, but it says that they do, you know, do pull requests in the right way. That's, from our perspective, that's being objective. When we be subjective, it's saying, you know, there are 14 string padding libraries. Left pad is the best of the 14 because it's still being maintained and it doesn't have any static analysis findings. Whereas somebody else may say, well, it's actually not that good because it doesn't have this other thing. And you can have differing opinions here. We haven't gone down that subjective route, and I know that there are lots of dragons there, but I think we want this to be useful to people. And one of the problems that I've seen with dashboards is you can give a whole bunch of you can give a whole bunch of data, but not convey any wisdom or you know, anything useful to the reader. So I want to try to avoid that. But this is super early proof of concept. Someone asked, you know, what do we need? We really need that funding. I need a you know, kind of people that can work on this more or less full time for a while to kind of move this stuff forward. I think right now that's the biggest, you know, impediment to moving things forward faster, is just that a lot of these things take a lot of time and trial and iteration and things, and it's you know, we just need folks kind of dedicated to this. Questions on this before I go on to the next one? Cool. I'll stop
No quick
sharing.
questions, but just a quick observation.
Yeah.
There's, you know, there was a question earlier about what's the relationship between the best practice, the CI best practices and the scorecard, and there they are on the bottom left and right respectively.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
Really cool to be able to see a demo. That does help make things chill too. We can see the screen like that.
Perfect. Ryan, feel free to share again, but until then, the next kind of sub project that we were working on is the security reviews. Security reviews is it's intended to be a community collection of security reviews that have been done against open source projects. So some of these are ones that have already been done. So things that, let's say, Trail of Bits or Cure 53 or NCC or anybody else has already done, that they make publicly available. We can link to that and say, hey, you're looking for something on zlib, here's a Trail of Bits assessment, or you're looking for, you know, whatever, things like that. We also want original reviews, meaning people submit a pull request with Markdown that contains you know, a review that they've done of a piece of open source. We try not to be overly prescriptive with the methodology, but we do ask people to describe their methodology. So if I were looking at, I don't know, whatever, X, but I was looking at it purely from a cryptography perspective, that's totally fine. And I can submit a review and I just say, this is only concerning the you know, crypto portions of this code. Or I've run static analysis, I triage the results, nothing popped out. Doesn't mean I did a full architecture review, doesn't mean anything else. The important thing is, I think that we're transparent in what that review includes. So people submit the review, it goes onto the site, other people can search. And in theory, we can expose all of that information to other things like the metric dashboard, but also to the package managers or to anybody else interested. I think the important thing is that that these things are available and used and kind of become a community resource. anticipate the question of how is this different than the vulnerability disclosure CVE stuff. And it's not a vulnerability disclosure vehicle. We make it super clear in 88-point font in the README, like, don't submit 0 days to us. We don't want 0 days. We're not going to merge them. You're just going to, you're not going to getting credit for it if you disclose that way. Instead, what we're looking for are either positive reviews, meaning I looked at this thing and this thing is safe, which to my knowledge doesn't exist anywhere else, or this thing is dangerous because let's say, because we found a vulnerability 2 years ago and the author hasn't done anything about it. So, in some ways that is kind of a vulnerability disclosure, but it's not like 0-daying the world. It's different. We have criteria for like what we accept. Or Elasticsearch, like, don't expose it to the internet, things like that, like operational, like really important security best practices. Jennifer, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I love the idea of collecting the reviews. The one place where I'd put forward a biased opinion is on the idea of positive reviews. I mean, in the ecosystem of vendors who will do security audits, it tends to be the less reputable ones that will say, oh yeah, this is totally secure, don't worry. And what is more typical is to have like not something so normative, but rather something informative, which is, the scope of this was 2 people across 22 people days. We looked at exactly this parts of the repo. In scope was this part of the architecture, out of scope was this part of the architecture, and here's the findings according to severity. So around like framing something as positive or negative, like, yes, use this, don't use that. I just want to put on the table that like, I would recommend we not take that approach because the reports that are likely to enable us to take that approach are probably the lower quality ones to begin with, if that makes sense. But I don't want this to be a distraction from the overall effort of what you're doing. And I get that there be dragons and that at some point we have to make a decision. But like the one place where I would caution us, and if there's one place where I could push back, it would probably be this, where it might make sense to instead talk about like, are there any, higher critical vulnerabilities that have not yet been patched, or some other metric of like, this is okay versus this is not okay. Just because saying that something is good probably actually means that it isn't. Or that the review was insufficient to tell. So that's just my kind of nitpicky.
Yeah, I totally hear you. So there is a review. So there's a review process that goes in, and there's a quality bar that we described. And without, I don't want to go too into it. So I'll post a link to this in the chat as well. But the reviews should be evidence-based. It can't be, I like project X because my buddy Charlie works on it, or I wrote it, or anything like that. It needs to be credible. And what is credible? Credible to the best of our ability to infer. It needs to be reasonable, meaning it's like sound security best practices. If somebody's like, no, SQL injection's a good thing. It inoculates you from whatever. Like, terrible. And it can't really be a 0-day. The problem I have with setting too high of a bar is we'll basically just be a collection of commercially supported security reviews. And I think there would be value in that too, but we're talking about that would cover approximately 0% of the ecosystem. Whereas I want, and I think the value in a lot of this is if I said, the NPM is odd. Is that safe? Has anybody looked at this? Like we use 100 million of these. Like, has anyone looked at this? The answer is almost always no. And changing that to, Yeah, someone's looked at it and they said it was fine. Now, they might be wrong a small percentage of the time, and they might be biased, and like there's all sorts of these are people involved, so it's not going to be perfect. And for the ones that are not commercial, like the bar is going to be different. I think that's okay, but I totally hear what you're saying about not, but certainly about like the lower quality vendors just getting paid for a gold star. I think the solution to that though is if somebody says that X is really good because awesomeness, and let's say they trick us into merging the PR, well, somebody else comes along and says, no, look here, and then the first now it's transparent, it's public. So if people want to kind of burn their reputation on that, that's fine, and we'll correct it as needed. Krab, you have your hands up too.
I'm sorry, I gotta write my code in to log into GitHub. Are any of my team participating in this particular project? Because we do this all the time, and we are refining our current component review process. So I'm wondering, are we collaborating on this?
I would love to partner with you on this. And your team. Yes.
Yeah, because we manage around 400,000 components and versions. So we have some subsection of that done like this.
Yep.
But we have a process. We're trying to get a better process, but maybe let me go poke my PCERT guy in the ass and tell him to get some people to start showing up in this working group.
That would be absolutely terrific. As an example, so I posted the PR review process, and here's a link to the quick start, which is just the form that we anticipate most people would fill out. But it just gives you an idea of like what we're looking for and the kinds of things. We do ask people to disclose, like, are they being compensated for this review? Are they associated with the project? Things like that. But
yeah, I think we definitely could collaborate on process and share what we've learned, and potentially, some of the results we might be able to publish.
That would be so terrific. Cool. So I think there's definitely room for more discussion about this and the bar. I'm also totally happy to like take a couple missteps at the beginning and find the right balance. Yeah. So I think over the next year, 6 months, big things. I want to rev the white paper, graduate the metric dashboard to something real and usable, and see this kind of security review thing kind of become a community and be sustainable and all of that. But to do that, especially the middle one, the metric dashboard resources, super awesome.
Are you thinking of once we have the process for asking for resources, like maybe submitting to get like developers to help build the final version of it, or do you have in mind what you want to? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think a developer it's there's just as much time needed to do like kind of the PM, like the design work on it, than to like actually click the buttons to make the thing, and both of those are bigger than a bread box. So I kind of need either someone who can do both or two people.
That makes sense. I'm really excited about the dashboard.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So we have 1 minute left. I hate to cut this off. This has been an amazing discussion. Really, really great meeting today. So just to kind of wrap things up, it seems like we've definitely had the objective met by getting everybody collaborating, and we've got some future coordination between groups. It seems like this clarification was useful to everyone. So before we make everything official, do the sign off, we'll have the next meeting and make sure that we don't have any massive conflicts, between those next 3 working groups. I don't think we will, but let's just go through the process and we'll get through it. And then we'll get to a point where we can have some more regular syncs with working group leads. So if you guys can continue to attend, especially in 2 weeks for the next working group, so that we can make sure that we don't have any overlap and conflict and that sort of thing. But this has been a great discussion. So thank you guys so much for showing up, and hopefully we can keep it continuing, and we'll see everybody hopefully here in 2 more weeks. Thank
Awesome.
you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Enjoy your day.